Welcome back to another episode of Microeconomics. Today we are still in Chapter 17, looking at behavioral economics and risk. In our previous episode, we looked at how does standard economic theory deal with risk. We used the expected utility theorem. Now we'll look at the main alternative to that. So the main alternative is called prospect theory. It was developed by a pair of psychologists. Now, there are many other theories out there of risk. Prospect theory, though, is one that has gotten the most attention and the most popularity out of all the alternatives out there. So there are a couple major differences between prospect theory and the expected utility theorem. So in expected utility, people care about the utility they get from the final outcome. Prospect theory, on the other hand, stresses that it's more about the change you get relative to a baseline, gains or losses. People care very differently about gains versus losses. How you got to some final destination and how you feel about that can matter if you got it through a gain or whether you got it through a loss. Here's a simple illustration. Let's say you have $2,000 and you're investing. Maybe your investments go really well and you get another 1,000, so now you have a total of 3,000. Now you can also imagine the same investor in a different situation. Maybe in some hypothetical alternative world, the same investor started with $4,000 and her investments went badly and she lost 1,000, so now she has 3,000. In both situations, whether you gain 2,000 and gain 1, or whether you start with 4,000 and lose 1, either way you still have 3,000 at the end of our story. However, our investor here might, understandably, feel different in each situation. If you start with a little and you gain another 1,000, you'll probably be pretty excited about that. If you start with a lot and you lost some of it, you're going to be upset that you had lost money. Thus, even though in both situations our investor has the same $3,000 at the end of our story, our investor is probably not equally happy in both these situations. So prospect theory tries to explain that by saying it's not really about the final outcome, but rather it's about if you make a gain or a loss compared to some baseline, compared to where you started from. So that's one difference between prospect theory and expected utility. So one critique of that, though, when I was presenting a paper that used this idea, was given by another economist. His critique was that if you care less about gains and losses relative to a baseline, there's basically no concept of more being better. So if you get richer and richer over time, it's saying your overall utility is going to depend just upon whether it's a gain or a loss, not whether you've accumulated more, and he thought that was unrealistic. And he's got a point there. So another big difference is that prospect theory involves what's called probability weighting. In particular, prospect theory says that people are going to overweight things that are unlikely and underweight things that are likely. So if you see a 1% risk, in prospect theory, you treat that as something being more than 1%. You might get really worried about that and act as if it is a 5% risk. It's also reversible, so if you saw something that was going to have with probability 90%, let's say, that's close to certain, but still some risk there, you would treat that as being less than 90%. There's been a lot of studies trying to look at, do people actually use probability weighting, and do they do it in this particular way? Evidence on that is not very clear-cut. Some peers say yes, they do. Other peers say no, they don't. That's a very short summary of the literature on this. In contrast, in expected utility, there's no probability weighting. The probability is the probability. You don't treat a 1% chance like a 5% chance. You treat a 1% chance like a 1% chance. Difference number 3. Prospect theory says that people be risk averse when they're looking at gains. They want to try to lock in their gains and don't want to lose those gains. With losses, though, people really don't like losses, so instead they'll keep doing more and more gambles in order to try to get back to their baseline. So actually it can make people risk-seeking or risk-loving when they're considering losses. That's a difference with expected utility. So expected utility, in particular on with diminishing marginal returns, says you should always be risk-averse, looking at a gain or a loss. So prospect theory says instead you're risk-averse with gains only and risk-loving with losses. So a story could tell to try to see where prospect theory is coming from is the following. So you have a gambler and they go to a casino. I already said in a previous episode that gambling is not necessarily irrational or at odds with economic theory. If you get some joy from the game for its own sake and don't care solely about money, then yes, gambling can be rational. So let's say a gambler goes to the casino and they're rational. If they win a couple of games early on, they have to decide, I'm going to stop, I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. You've surely heard that phrase, quit while you're ahead. It's referring to this idea you want to lock in your gains, which is consistent with prospect theory. On the other hand, if our gambler starts losing money, he's not very happy about that. He decides to keep gambling more and more and more. He's going to stay there all night and try to win back what he lost and break even. And maybe he gets hooked on this and gets addicted to gambling. So a story like that, which sounds reasonable, is consistent with prospect theory. So there's been a lot of experiments trying to look at this, and evidence is also rather mixed on this. Some people say that yes, people are risk-loving with losses as prospect theory would predict. Other people say that people are risk-averse with losses as standard econ theory would predict. So it's not very clear-cut on this element either. So the big differences are with prospect theory and expected utility are the following. So prospect theory stresses gains and losses. Standard theory stresses the final outcome. Prospect theory uses probability weights. Standard theory is not. Standard theory says that people are always risk-averse. Prospect theory says people are risk-averse with gains, but not with losses. Now, I do take issue with the probability weighting. Evidence is mixed, but I would argue that probability weighting is quite unrealistic. So if people start overweighting events that are unlikely, it has some very strange implications. So I'm not the first to observe this, but I will use the example in my paper because it makes the idea very clear. So in Wilson 2018, I showed two hypothetical gambles. So in our first lottery, you could get $10 with probability 30%. The other 70% of the time, you get nothing. In our second lottery, you get $10 with probability 20%. With probably 10%, you also get $10. With probably 70%, you get nothing. So just look at this for even a very brief moment, you'll realize that Lottery 1 and Lottery 2 are the same. So either way over here, you're still getting $10 of probability 30%. I just broke it out into two categories here. So it's obvious to anyone that these two lotteries are the same thing. So you should be indifferent between them. Under prospect theory, though, that's not going to happen. So under prospect theory, people overweight things that are unlikely, that 10% chance then are going to be inflated to something more than 10%, and you also inflate the 20% chance. With that inflation of those probabilities, it's probably not going to add up to 30%. It's probably not going to add up to the weight on 30% either. There are some variants of prospect theory that try to resolve this, but you do run into this problem with just about any kind of probability weighting scheme. As long as you start altering the probabilities, then you start getting weird cases where two identical lotteries end up being not identical. So I think it's a serious problem with prospect theory and with probability weighting in general. The overall evidence, though, I should say, is mixed. So one paper, not sure how you pronounce that, not going to try. So a paper written in 2014 said that prospect theory works better. Another paper written back in 94 said that expected utility works better. I don't think there's any consensus on which one is best. And like I said, there's a lot of other theories out there as well that are competing with prospect theory and expected utility. What is generally acknowledged, though, that there's no theory that consistently explains all aspects of people's behavior under risk. So they've all got flaws of some sort, and at the moment, there's no single best theory out there. There's a lot of ongoing research on trying to find it. One thing that does seem to be well established, though, is that with expected utility, things tend to go haywire more when the probabilities get close to 0 and close to 1. However, it's not clear, though, if probability weighting is the best way to deal with that. So with risk, there are some real violations of economic theory and also a lot of uncertainty as to what's the best way forward. How do people actually handle risk? So that wraps up our section on risk. Be sure to join us for our next episode, which will look at a variety of other oddities about human behavior. That's all for now.